the adequacy or inadequacy of man as an English equivalent of the biblical Hebrew noun ish. The common noun ish is one of the most frequently occurring nouns in the Hebrew Bible, appearing 2,183 times according to one of the more recent reference works. I myself have not yet investigated every instance. Yet in recent years I have sought to clarify how the word ish generally functions. I composed 2 articles that appeared recently, both based upon my SBL presentations in 2007. This first article was published in February and seems to have been well received. The second article was published earlier in November, so we have yet to see whether it withstands scrutiny. Meanwhile, today I wish to build on that philological and grammatical work and take it as if already established by exploring the implications for translation into English. I will focus on accuracy in semantic content. Of course, that is only one of the many factors that translators need to take into account, but for the sake of simplicity, it is the only factor that I am assessing here. First, though, I will summarize my earlier findings about ish, expressed as 3 main points. 1. It is primarily a term of affiliation, a relational noun. That is to say, as a term of affiliation, the noun ish bears a dual reference, referring, for example, to a participant in the situation in question. The word's function is to relate both of these entities to each other. I can sum it up this way. Someone who is an ish almost always, if not always, of somebody or something else. And this seems to be true even if that somebody or something else is only implicit in the text, which is often the case. The second main finding, reported in my articles, is that the primary meaning of ish functions independently of its gender content. This fact appears to be true of every biblical Hebrew noun that has a female counterpart, such as av or ach or ben. That is to say, in the case of ish, its meaning consists of more than one semantic component. The primary component is about affiliation, while the other component is about gender. Now, this slide says not female rather than male gender in order to reflect how biblical Hebrew operates. Hebrew grammar divides the animate world into 2 categories: marked or female and unmarked, not female. It appears that what we customarily call grammatical masculine was used to refer not only to male humans or animals, but also to figures whose gender was unknown or indeterminate, or believed to transcend gender classification. Now, the usual designation of that non-female category as male is a simplification that is often safe, but it is too imprecise for the present purpose. I will avoid it in this presentation. Recognition of distinct meaning components for ish means that in practice, the presence of each component must be analyzed separately. My third main finding was that when it refers to a class, its gender meaning is muted. It means only that the class is not solely female. This, too, was a general finding for all Hebrew nouns that have a female counterpart. It is not a property exclusive to the noun ish. The key to this last point is how the noun is employed in terms of its determination and its referential function. If the noun is definite and its reference is to a class rather than marking out what is particular or unique, then its primary meaning component is of course salient, whereas its gender meaning component is almost entirely suppressed. Not only are men in view, but also women are in view by default. Similarly, if the noun is indefinite and its reference is to a genus rather than to a specific member of a genus, then the social gender of the party being referred to remains relatively unspecified, grammatically speaking, and again, women are in view by default. Of course, context can still constrain a referent's social gender to be male by connotation, even when the noun's denotation by itself is not restricted to male gender. I will now present and analyze various examples, situations where man has often been used to render ish, and yet the semantic equivalence between those two words is fairly weak. All three examples are drawn from the book of Exodus. Afterward, we will look at the significance of these examples. In our first case, Pharaoh, who has enslaved the Israelites, is addressing his taskmasters and invoking the functional plural of ish, anashim. Tichbad havodah ala anashim. For the sake of quick orientation, here is the co-text in a typical rendering. Let heavier work be laid upon the anashim. What does ish mean in this case? The type of affiliation that our personal noun conveys is clarified by this clause itself, for the directive applies to those who are already performing labor, a fact that evokes the most basic sense of anashim as participant members. The word anashim affiliates the reference with their task or endeavor. In other words, when Pharaoh employs the term anashim, he identifies the people whom he has in mind not by their nature, but rather by their function. The co-text thus yields a connotation for ish contextually as referring to laborers. Meanwhile, we ask, what is the social gender sense of ish in this construction, or anashim? Notice that the noun's determination is definite, while the referential function is to a grammatical class, that is, to whom it may concern. The group itself may be unique and determined, but its members are not specified. So, what the word anashim says about social gender, grammatically speaking, is muted, establishing only that the referents are not solely female. In other words, the grammatically masculine plural conveys that Pharaoh believes that at least one member of this group is not female. The gender of the rest of the group, however, he has not specified. But why does the text depict Pharaoh as being so vague? It's because the type of work in question is brickmaking, and in the ancient Near East it was understood that brickmaking was men's work. So under the circumstances, the text's composer could rely on the ancient audience to construe Pharaoh as having only men in mind. Pharaoh did not need to specify gender because it would go without saying. In short, here is our noun's meaning in Hebrew. Laborers, at least one of whom is not female. Now let us look at the English side. It is common to render ha'anashim in this instance as the men. How well does this rendering convey the relatively muted gender component of ish? Well, in English idiom, when the expression the men is used to point to a particular group, it conveys predominant, if not total, maleness. So the rendering here over-translates the gender meaning component of the Hebrew noun. It places more emphasis on gender than was present in the source text. Meanwhile, what about the primary meaning component of ish? Is it successfully conveyed? Here the answer is yes. For in the plural, the word men has a lexical sense of participation that this context evokes, namely, as Merriam-Webster's dictionary puts it, the working force as distinguished from the employer. On balance, here is what the rendering means, mostly male workforce. Now let us construct a comparison table. I have compared ish in the source language with man in the target language. I have analyzed the contextual sense along two dimensions, the affiliational meaning component, which is primary, and a gender meaning component. Is rendering as man accurate? We have identified a problem, whose significance and whose frequency I will discuss later. Let us proceed, meanwhile, to a second case. This instance concerns what the narrator tells us about Moses just before the 10th plague. Gam ha'ish Moshe gadol ma'od be'eretz Mitzrayim. For the sake of quick orientation, here is a fairly common rendering for the co-text. Moreover, the Ish Moses was very great in the land of Egypt. What does Ish mean in this case? I assert that the text's composer could reliably count on its ancient audience to construe our noun here as denoting representation. Here is how that works. Being a term of affiliation, the word Ish relates Moses to another party. That party was mentioned earlier in the same verse, namely God, who, after all, is the main character throughout the Exodus story. Vayitein Adonai et chen ha'am be'enei Mitzrayim, gam ha'ish Moshe, etc. The text's composer could rely upon its ancient audience to bear in mind as background that God had commissioned Moses to take the Israelites out of Egypt. Ever since then, Moses has been acting above all else as God's envoy. The context of situation thus evokes the lexical sense of Ish as a representative, which appears in the Bible in more than 200 cases. This conclusion, as applied here, is confirmed by 4 nearly identical cases in other biblical books in which the same construction appears with regard to individuals who have been appointed to represent an authority figure. For example, Ha'ish Gabriel in the book of Daniel, Ha'ish Mordechai in the book of Esther. The fronted syntax, placing Ish before the name, identifies Moses by his office, special envoy. Meanwhile, we ask, what is the social gender sense of Ish in this construction? Notice that the noun's determination is definite and that it points to a unique referent. This means that the noun's gender component is fully salient. Yet I will write that gender ascription off to the side because in this case it is incidental. For in Hebrew, whenever one uses a substantive to refer to a particular human being, one expresses social gender on a grammatical level, in this case by choosing between one of 2 counterpart terms, Ish versus Isha, for the sake of grammatical gender concord. In making this choice, the narrator is not calling attention to Moses' gender here. Rather, the specification of a non-female term is a grammatical feature rather than a semantic one. So, this then is the meaning of our Hebrew word in this verse. Special envoy, where gender is incidental. Now let us look at the English side. It is not uncommon to render Ish in this instance as man. In English idiom, when the word man is used to point to a specific individual, it conveys maleness. Now, we should also have to ask, should this rendering convey gender? And the answer is no. And that is because of a crucial difference between Hebrew and English. With regard to the marking of social gender, there is a syntactical asymmetry between the 2 languages. Hebrew and English do not mark social gender in the same way. This is not startling news. Consider these familiar examples. Vayar ish mitzri maket ish ivri. In this first verse, the 2 disputants are male by implication from the act that Moses witnesses. Vayish alu ish l'reyehu l'shalom. In the second instance, the referents are the men named Moses and Jethro. So why is it that English translations of these passages, going back to the King James Version, almost always render the Hebrew in gender-neutral terms? Why didn't they render the party called Ish Mitzri as an Egyptian man, and the reflexive Ish as each man? The answer is that in English idiom, the gender marker is usually deployed only where the context requires an explicit mention. If gender either is already understood or is simply not germane, then the normative rendering leaves out the gender marker. The reference, social gender, goes without saying. This has nothing to do with feminist or egalitarian ideology. It is simply the way that English works. And so, in the case of our verse, where Moses' manhood is both known and momentarily irrelevant, a rendering as man over-translates the Hebrew gender marker. Now, because affiliation is primary, we must ask whether our rendering succeeds in conveying that meaning component of Ish. In this case, the answer is no. Although in certain usages the word man can at least denote a subordinate, as in the sentence, "I'll have my man bring the car around," the present context elicits the sense of man simply as a male human being, not in relation to another party. Let us return to our comparison table, which I now expand to include our second case. Is this rendering accurate? This time we have identified problems in both dimensions. So let us proceed to the third example, which will further illustrate the role of context in ascribing social gender to the referent of ish. This text begins the protasis of a law that is in the covenant collection. V'chi yigof shor ish et shoreehu. Again, here is the cotext in a typical published rendering. If the ox of ish injures the ox of his neighbor. In this case, the type of affiliation that ish conveys is evident from this clause itself. For in terms of syntax, our noun is juxtaposed with rea, neighbor, and the situation is governed and defined by the verb, which indicates that the two neighbors have been brought into an antagonistic relationship with each other. They are now parties to a legal case, as if to say, "See you in court." This situation thus evokes the most basic sense of ish as a participant member. And the connotation for ish is a party to a legal proceeding. Now let us look at the gender component. Our noun is indefinite and it points to a non-specific group. This means that the gender component of our noun will be muted. Again, grammatically speaking, women are in view by default. Some scholars have speculated that women were excluded from view unless explicitly mentioned, but my analysis found that this is not how biblical Hebrew works. Rather, the text's audience was expected to construe any noun in the situation gender inclusively, unless they had good reason to conclude that women were not in view. Others have speculated that because the text says ish, the composer of this passage had in mind the image of a male as representing both men and women, presumably because in ancient Israel the typical owners of property were men. But that concept is unnecessary. Procedurally, as stated earlier, a male image emerged only when the cotext or context of situation provided good reason to conclude that women were not also in view. And when it came to owning an ox, there was no reason to exclude women from view. Nothing, at least nothing that we know of today, precluded women in ancient Israel, as a category of persons, from owning property such as cattle. Indeed, the book of Job makes passing reference to shor almanah, a widow's ox. Such an incidental detail seems to reflect the audience's own assumptions about Israelite gender roles. Therefore, given the grammatical construction, we must assume that in the eyes of the original audience, women remained in view with this particular usage of the word ish. In short, here is the plain sense of our Hebrew noun in this context: party to a legal proceeding regardless of gender. Now let us look at the English side. A number of modern translations have rendered ish in this instance as one man. Does this rendering convey muted gender? No. For the past century or two, the first mental image from the word man has been a male one. According to what I find in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, this construction is not one of those that evokes the inclusive sense of as man. In standard English idiom, man here appears to mean male. In other words, the rendering here mistranslates the gender meaning component of the Hebrew noun, distorting the reader's view of the original text. What about affiliation? Does our rendering succeed in conveying that meaning component of ish? Strictly speaking, the answer is no. Rather, the phrase one man evokes the lexical sense of man as a male human being. At the same time, the context of situation does imply affiliation. What was explicit in the source text has been made implicit in the translation. but I will treat that shift in meaning as relatively minor for the time being. Let us return to our comparison table, which I now expand to include our third case. Is this rendering accurate? We have again identified a problem. Let us now take stock of what we have seen. We have looked at 3 examples. In assessing the semantic accuracy of the renderings, I have identified 4 problems. How important are these problems? That question I will address shortly. But first, let's talk about a related issue. How widespread are these problems? The first case represents those situations where the referent is either decidedly male or typically male, and yet the emphasis of the Hebrew utterance is not on gender. Arguably, if the text's composer had meant to emphasize gender, the word used would have been gever or even zachar rather than ish. In such cases, the maleness of ish is incidental. What portion of biblical instances seem to fall into this category? About 20%. About half of those instances are like the second case shown here, where the sense of ish is as a representative of another party, a nuance that the English word man rarely possesses. The third case is typical of another type of situation, the ones in which ish refers to a class. Roughly 75% of all biblical instances of ish fall in that category. Even in instances whose context excludes women, gender is incidental, such that rendering in terms of man probably violates English idiom by overstating gender. In short, these cases suggest that rendering ish as man is suspect and may compromise semantic accuracy in about 95% of all instances. Now, I do not mean to suggest that man is never an accurate rendering for ish. Its use is defensible in at least 2 situations. Consider where ish has a gender-inclusive sense and where man retains its original gender-neutral meaning. For example, in this case, from the Exodus story, ish points to a genus, and it is contextually counterposed with behemah, giving it a clear gender-inclusive force. Ish refers to all human beings, not only to men. Lo yecharatz kelev leshono lemeish va'ad behemah. In such a case, man matches the Hebrew connotation just fine, if one grants that this old gender-neutral usage of man is still good English idiom, which personally I am prepared to do for other translations, not necessarily my own. And then there are the situations where ish has a clearly male sense and where man clearly means adult male. For example, in this instance from the Covenant collection, similar to the case that we considered earlier, V'chi yigach shor et ish o et isha v'meit. Regarding the noun ish itself, the context makes clear via counterposition with isha that in this case only a non-female victim is in view with ish. As for the nature of affiliation, this unfortunate victim is a party to this situation together with the ox and also with the ox's owner, who is mentioned at the end of the verse. The question then is whether this affiliation ought to be conveyed in English explicitly or implicitly. Although the most technically precise contextual rendering would probably be when an ox gores a party, male or female, to death, one could consider it accurate enough to render simply when an ox gores a man or woman to death, which is a very common translation, although it involves a subtle change in meaning. Affiliation is still clear, albeit only implicit. So out of all instances of ish in the Bible, how many might be accurately rendered in English as man? The types of cases shown here account for less than 5% of all biblical instances. The mistranslation of the main thrust of ish, namely affiliation, how much does it matter? I'm going to confine my formal remarks to only one type of translation, the dynamic equivalence or functional equivalence type. Such a translation seeks to convey contextual precision. To the extent that we translators fail to disambiguate ish where that is possible, and where ambiguity is not an evident literary feature, we in effect bleach the Hebrew of its color and flatten its texture. To suggest the extent to which cognizance of the affiliative sense of ish can affect translation into English, we can make a quick comparison of three gender-sensitive idiomatic translations. In the book of in the book of Genesis, the noun ish occurs in the singular 108 times. To account for those instances, the NRSV and the TNIV translations employed 10 and 7 English terms as equivalents for ish, respectively. In contrast, the one published translation so far that has attempted to treat ish as a term of affiliation, CJPS, which is found in the book The Contemporary Torah, and which I worked on, employed more than twice as many contextually precise equivalents for ish. As for the over-translation of gender, how much does it matter? I mean, if the guys being referred to are male anyway, what is the harm in calling them men? Let us go back to our first example. In my experience, contemporary readers are predisposed to believe that in the biblical world only men counted. Thus they tend to construe this rendering as if Pharaoh is singling out the Israelite men versus the women, when in fact that was not his point. In other words, this kind of rendering makes Pharaoh seem more focused on gender than was actually the case. Similarly, the over-translation of maleness makes the whole Bible seem more focused on gender than was actually the case. Which brings me to my conclusion. Judging solely on the grounds of semantic accuracy, rendering ish as man is usually inadequate. In those instances, when the usage of man can be justified, the burden of proof is on the translator to show semantic equivalence in terms of both affiliation and gender. Skepticism is appropriate, since much of this is a new approach, but at least now you see what is at stake, and now I welcome discussion with you.